Welcome back, PetaPixel viewers. It is Chris Niccolls here. Thank you for joining us for another episode. And we have one that you guys asked for today. It is the battle between the two best Micro Four Thirds cameras on the planet. This is going to be a battle to the death, and they're going to fight and argue and kiss and make up.
Don't scratch them.
So in this corner we have the Panasonic G9 II, and in this corner we have the OM system Olympus OM-1. And both of these cameras represent the best of the Micro Four Thirds technology that these two companies bring to the table. So as usual, we're going to go through a whole bunch of criteria. We're going to fight them out. We're going to see which one wins in the end. Okay, so first category, we talk about handling, the ergonomics, the body design on these two cameras. Now, I am very familiar with the OM-1 because this is my EDC and I use it a lot for work. However, I've of course used the Panasonic lineup quite extensively, not only because we've been looking at Panasonic cameras for a long time and they have a fairly similar structure, even going back to cameras like the S5, but also because the camera like the S5 II, the S5 IIX, and now the G9 II have the exact same bodies, and we use those all the time for the show. And I have to say that both cameras are actually really nice to use ergonomically. I mean, the Panasonic, for example, has some nice standouts. I do like the white balance, ISO, and exposure comp buttons on the top here. The autofocusing joystick is nice, and I like that the back control pad is also a dial. But there are some issues that I do have with the Panasonic body. I mean, the biggest, most egregious one, first off, is this back control dial. It's in a really easy place to turn, but it's also in a really easy place to accidentally turn. And Jordan and I are both constantly finding that our shutter speed or our shutter angle for video just is always changing at the most frustrating times. Also, the mode dial does not have a locking switch, and we really do prefer to have that on a camera. Now, the OM-1 has some really nice, thoughtful design features as well. First off, the grip, I actually really prefer this. I feel like it's a little bit smaller and it molds to the hand really well. The control dials are easy to turn, but they're more recessed than the Panasonic, and I find that I never accidentally change them. Locking switch on the mode dial, that's fantastic. We still get a nice autofocusing joystick, and it is a little bit more compact. Now, in the end of the day, you want a camera that's going to be reliable. We've used both of these cameras extensively in the field, and they've both been very reliable. We can depend on them. But the OM-1 does give you proper weather sealing ratings, and I have to say that I've done terrible to these cameras and the Olympus ones that came before it, and they all survive. They can take serious abuse. As well, I do feel that the Olympus lenses, for the most part, tend to be better sealed than the Panasonic lenses. Both dependable cameras, but I'm going to give the win in this category to the OM-1. Okay, let's cover displays next, and I gotta say, this is a pretty close one here. They're very similar. First, let's talk about the OM-1. It's got a fully articulating 3-inch LCD, 1.62 million dots, and the touchscreen functions work great. And when you look at the Panasonic, this has a very similar setup. Similar kind of fully articulating LCD back panel, but this is slightly higher res, 1.84 million dots. Okay, so maybe a slight edge to the Panasonic, but in practical terms, the difference between the two back panels is pretty negligible. Where we have a bigger difference is actually when it comes to the EVF. So the Panasonic has a well-magnified 3.69 million dot EVF, which is absolutely suitable for the resolution that we're talking about here on the files. But the OM-1 gives us even more. We get a beautiful 5.76 million dot EVF. I mean, both of these EVFs refresh at 120 hertz. They're great for sports, action, and wildlife shooting, but the OM-1 is better for playback, just gives us more detail when we're viewing our scenes, and so this is our winner when it comes to displays. All right, let's talk about the buffers now and the ability to shoot bursts on both of these cameras. The Panasonic G9 II has a very fast 10 frames per second with autofocus mechanical shutter burst rate. If you then go to electronic shutter, you get up to 60 frames per second with autofocus performance. That's quite incredible. As far as how long you can sustain that burst, we're finding about 200 raw shots in a row before the camera slows down. That's really very impressive. Now, when it comes to the OM system OM-1, we have a pretty similar story here. We're getting 10 frames per second mechanical shutter shooting with autofocus. That's on par with the Panasonic. When you go to electronic shutter, the Olympus does have a faster readout speed, roughly about 125th of a second because of that stack sensor. That is nice when you're shooting electronic shutter mode. It'll go up to 50 frames per second with autofocus. That's pretty close to the Panasonic. It can push beyond that without autofocus to 120 frames per second. The Panasonic would give you 75 frames per second. Regardless, by this point, we're getting tons of shots, more than I think you generally need in a practical situation. But what about the buffer on the OM-1? It isn't going to get you 200 raw shots in a row. It's going to be more like 140. So when we consider everything all together, I have to say I think the Panasonic has a slightly better buffer and burst rate situation. Therefore, it's the winner. Okay, so let's talk about battery life next on these two cameras. So first off, the Panasonic G9 II, SEPA rated for 390 shots on a full battery. The OM-1 rated for 520, but we know SEPA ratings don't always translate realistically into practical terms. So let's talk about what we found just through our own shooting. So first off, when it comes to video, I can shoot the Olympus OM-1 on a full day, all day, and I can get through an entire shoot with one battery just barely. But when we use a camera like the Panasonic G9 II, we find for video work that we're invariably changing that battery 3/4 of the way through the shoot. We always have to have a spare on us. Now, when it comes to photography, I'll say, it's not really as big a deal. You don't often push through your camera's battery life with a full day of shooting, but the OM-1 will go with more shots before the battery expires. And the last thing I want to mention too is when we are shooting video and shooting projects, the OM-1 startup time is very quick. I can turn the camera off, turn it back on, and it's basically ready to shoot. With the G9 II, what Jordan finds is there's quite a delay in the startup time, so he'll often just let the camera go into sleep so he's ready to shoot right away. I mean, that's great, except again, that hurts your battery life. So this is another win for the OM system, OM-1. Okay, so I think it's time to talk about lenses now, and I don't think we're really going to do this as a category per se, because unlike other companies where we're comparing, Sony or versus Nikon or Canon or whatever, here we actually have a shared lens mount and lenses that you can use across both cameras. So we're going to basically just call this a wash. But on that same note, you've got tons of lenses from both companies. I mean, Panasonic have a lot of lenses from compact wide angles all the way up to extreme telephotos. OM as well have a very similar setup. You've got fantastic telephotos like the new 150 to 400. You've got tons of ultra wides. I mean, the fact is, you got lots of choice, and there's tons of third-party support. And you can mix and match these lenses across both lens mounts. You can go Panasonic on Olympus, Olympus on Panasonic. It doesn't matter. Now, the only downside, if you do decide to mix and match and put Panasonic lenses on an OM body or vice versa, you're basically just not going to get sync OIS. So what this means is the lens's image stabilization can still work, or you can still use the built-in image stabilization that Panasonic and OM bodies have. The only thing you're really missing out is getting both image stabilization in the body and the lens to work in conjunction. That's not really that big a downside, honestly. It happens whichever direction you go. So frankly, I call that a wash as well. Now, the Panasonic G9 II is unique because it's the only Panasonic Micro Four Thirds camera body that has the new phase detect autofocus. But even using OM or Olympus glass on that Panasonic G9 II, you still get phase detect autofocus. There's no downside there. And although I understand that Panasonic users will probably naturally migrate to using Panasonic lenses, and the same with Olympus and OM bodies, I still feel like the big benefit here for Micro Four Thirds is you have such a huge line of lenses from both brands that you can happily mix and match. So again, it's a wash. I'm not going to give an advantage to either brand there. All right, I know this is a big one here. Image quality. Which camera edges out the other when it comes to image quality? Now, first off, we're talking about similar sensors, both Micro Four Thirds, but the Panasonic G9 II does have the advantage of being a 25 megapixel sensor versus the OM-1's 20 megapixels. Now, let's say that you want higher resolution than 20 or 25 megapixels. Well, both cameras give you an option to shoot multi-shot high-res modes, both handheld or on a tripod. But the Panasonic G9, again, has an advantage here. With its 25 megapixel sensor, you can go up to 100 megapixel files maximum, and you can do that whether you're on a tripod or whether you're holding the camera by hand. That's really nice. With the OM system OM-1, you can go up to 80 megapixels, but that's only if the camera has no movement whatsoever. It has to be on a tripod. And although the stabilizer is excellent, if you do handheld high-res shots, the OM-1 can only give you 50 megapixel files. Okay, so the G9 II does absolutely have advantages when it comes to overall resolution, megapixels, but we also think that dynamic range is incredibly important. So we did some tests ourselves because the G9 II has a sensor that's very similar to the GH6, and we found the GH6's dynamic range to be fairly abysmal. Now, the G9 II does improve things ever so slightly, as you can see here. However, it's still below 800 ISO, going to have less dynamic range and way more noise than it really should. And when you look here at the OM-1, it's just doing a better job. Less noise, very good detail, still good dynamic range. And so even though we have higher resolution with the Panasonic G9 II, I have to give the overall win to the OM system OM-1.
All right, it's me, Jordan, so you know what that means. It's time to talk about the video comparison of these two cameras. And the OM-1 was actually a really big step up for the OM systems lines concerning video, but it does have a really weird quirk. So when you're recording in its 8-bit mode, which is when you're using any of its standard profiles, including the flat profile, which is optimized for video, you're actually getting very soft results and quite noisy as well. If you switch over to the 10-bit mode, there we get sharp, detailed video, but unfortunately it's only available if you're willing to record log or use their HLG video profiles. So I feel like there's always a compromise with the OM-1. If you want something that you can just shoot and deliver, say you're like doing videos for a fly fishing shop or something like that, and you're gonna just shoot it in the flat profile, well then you've got much worse video quality than if you're willing to commit to the longer workflow of shooting HLG or log on it. I mean, it's just a frustrating camera. Compare that to the G9 Mark II, where we're getting almost all of the features from Panasonic's GH6, but you're combining that with the really good phase detect autofocus on this now, and even better stabilization than that. And this is a camera that can shoot 4K 120p that is oversampled, so it's incredibly detailed. You get access to the full vlog profile, which is my absolute favorite log profile for working with. And if I don't want to shoot log, well then I love a lot of Panasonic's default profiles, but there I'm getting beautiful sharp video when I set those up. One other weird quirk is the OM-1 sensor actually reads a little bit faster than what we see on the G9 Mark II, but it doesn't have access to 4K 120p. It just feels like the processor there is what's actually holding the camera back, not its sensor. So the clear winner here is the G9 Mark II. It just mops the floor with the OM-1 if you're looking to shoot video.
Okay, so now it's time to talk about autofocus on these two platforms. And the first thing I'm going to say is there's no dogs in this competition. It is true though, in all seriousness, both cameras are very effective autofocusing platforms, but remember the Panasonic G9 II is the first Panasonic Micro Four Thirds camera to have the new phase detect autofocus, and that does give the OM-1 very stiff competition, whereas I would say previous to that, the OM-1 would always win. So one thing I am noticing, first off, OM-1, the continuous autofocusing and tracking has never been improved from the original EM-1 Mark III or EM-1X, and so therefore it is still a little bit wishy-washy. Sometimes it loses its frame or just doesn't want to follow something, and I feel the Panasonic G9 II does a much better job with tracking inanimate objects. However, I will say that the OM-1's continuous autofocus plus tracking does a great job when it's in conjunction with one of its subject detection modes, whether it be a person's face or eye or their animal detector, their planes, trains, automobiles. I mean, they added a lot of subject detection modes, and in that regard, it works very effectively. And so I like the OM-1 a lot as, in particular, a wildlife platform. I found it to be very effective. But the Panasonic G9 II comes back with new subject detection capabilities. It also does a great job tracking humans. You can also even do animal eye detect. So, I mean, in that regard, again, they're very similar and they're very effective. But it has been a while since we did full reviews on both cameras, so we decided let's do another one of our classic Jordan running at the camera autofocusing tests. He runs fast and fierce. So first off, the OM system OM-1 autofocus test with Jordan. You can see here the hit rate was actually quite effective. We're shooting 60 millimeters at f4 here, and you can see it does catch his face quite well. There is some parts where it loses a couple frames there, but it did a pretty good job tracking them. But now let's look at the Panasonic G9 II. So again, we're shooting at 60 millimeters at f4, and we're seeing that the hit rate, I would say, is slightly better here. It just seemed to track his face a little bit more effectively as he ran towards the camera. Fairly similar results, but overall, looking at all the autofocus performance here together with the better tracking for inanimate objects on the G9 II and the slightly higher hit rate, I will say that I feel the G9 II has the advantage when it comes to autofocus performance. Okay, so which camera is top of the hill? I think the first thing we have to understand is that both these cameras were very close in the competition, maybe perhaps with the exception of video. Both are very effective cameras. I've used them both. I'd be happy to use either one, honestly. I think they do a great job. But if you were looking for a true hybrid stills and video camera, the clear winner is the Panasonic G9 II. It just makes more sense. As a video camera, it's become one of Jordan's favorites, and it does have far more capability than the OM-1. But if video is not your primary interest, or you're looking primarily to stills-based camera, well then the OM-1 has a lot going for it. I mean, it has won the most categories today, and if you really look at the results, it certainly still has very fast shooting, great autofocus performance and all that, but it comes down to, in my opinion, a more enjoyable experience to use as a camera body. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this battle between these two great Micro Four Thirds cameras. I know you have opinions. I know you're gonna get very vocal about it, so leave those in the comments below. Why yell at your screen when you can just tell us directly in the comments below? As well, check out the podcast. It's on the same channel, PetaPixel Podcast. You can also search that in all of your favorite podcasting apps. Leave your comments there as well. We love to answer those. But we always appreciate you joining us. Thank you guys so much. And click that notification bell, and that way you won't miss our next episode on PetaPixel.